Today on My World of Work, we're speaking to Thapelo Moloi, an accomplished development economist, MBA graduate, and a Master of Philosophy candidate. With over 15 years of experience in transformation, enterprise and supplier development, ESG programs, and SMME growth across mining, finance, and development sectors. This conversation is about his journey, the studies that shaped him, the work he's doing today, the realities of the development and ESG landscape, and the dreams he's still building today. No, and the dreams he's still building towards. Not wasting time. Abel, welcome to In Conversation.
Hello, Tsepisa, and thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. I would like you to take us back to what inspired you to study economics at UNISA. UNISA is known to be a very rigorous institution. What inspired you to study there?
Yeah. Once again, thank you so much for the opportunity. And you're quite right. It is such a rigorous university. And back at the time when I joined UNISA, I don't think there was the type of support that you see that has been extended to students nowadays, because most of the learning methodology, the time I was at UNISA, was largely about, if I may use numbers, 80% of it was largely driven by yourself. It was literally driven by yourself. You had to take the material that was given to you, you had to make sense of it. Yes, the lecturers were there, but in essence, most of the time, it was really you trying to push through the material. And I think as someone who was coming from fresh out of high school, where there was quite a lot of support that you get, and of course, it was a public school, but we did get some sort of support, and you are thrust into this world of tertiary education where you're reminded most of the time, Jorge, it's you really that drives yourself. I think it was a bit of a culture shock for me, but over time, I think the second semester of my first year, and I must concede that after failing the first semester, I realized that I needed to push quite a bit. So UNISA really was not my first choice, but of all the universities that I had applied to, it was the one university that had responded in time and allowed me, the space then to go in there. Plus, I had applied for your NSFAS and everything like that. And all of those things were, of course, approved. So that's how I found myself into UNISA. But Sepisa, to be honest with you, the first semester was really a culture shock to me. But I was driven, wanted to make sure that I achieve and go to school, because that's how I saw myself getting the opportunity out of the background where I come from. But yeah, in terms of UNISA, it wasn't my first choice, but I eventually landed there.
So what was your first choice? Which university was your first choice, and also was economics your first choice?
Interestingly, I'll start with the second one. Economics was not my first choice. Economics, I think, came in as my second choice. Initially, my first choice was financial management. And what really changed me into taking economics, because both were, by the way, from UNISA, both were presented to me. So they said, we'll take you for financial management, we'll take you for economics as well, but choose which one you want to do, right? And at the time when I started, there were talks about the global financial crisis, and you're talking of inflation, interest rates, a global meltdown, and all those sort of stuff. I remember very, very well and candidly, because that time the Minister of Finance was Trevor Manuel, and the governor was the late Tito Mboweni, and of course you had the president being Thabo Mbeki, the so-called TTTs and stuff like that. But those people really captured my interest, and I wanted to understand, so what is this recession? What does it look like? Why does it affect everyone globally? And what is it about, these issues and concepts that they are talking about? In the very essence of them, how do they affect us? Because they kept on saying, let's tighten our belt. I remember those three words from Tito Mboweni. We need to tighten our belts. We need to tighten our belts. I was like, what belts are we tightening? And why do we need to tighten our belts? So that's how I landed myself in economics. And I must be honest that it has been such a beautiful journey for me, because I learned quite a lot in this space. I found financial management rather as static. A little bit of it was, to me, not that interesting in terms of the changing world that we had found ourselves at that particular point in time. So I've never regretted taking economics as my major from that end. So when I then grappled with these concepts, theories, models, and frameworks within economics, I realized that actually this is what I wanted to do. In terms of the university, I'm a Joburger. I grew up in Joburg and still live in Joburg as well. I wanted to go to Wits, right? So that was my first choice. My second choice was UCT. My third choice was then UNISA. And the fourth one that I had looked at that time was UKZN. I must be honest that UKZN and UCT was really just to get out of Joburg. You know, born here, raised here. Let me try something different. I wanted to try those, but my first two in Joburg was Wits as well as looking at UNISA.
Oh, okay. So, if you don't mind, can you just explain to me what economics is? I just know the term, but I don't really know what it really entails.
Yeah. So in how I explain it is it sits as a social science, right? Although it does employ very scientific models to explain phenomenon, as well as the frameworks that we use, most of them do rely quite a bit on mathematics. They do rely on statistics as well as, aspects related to finance in a way. So statistics, finance, mathematics, all those sciences, they do help us to actually get to framing models and stuff like that. I mean, I think that's what makes economics a little bit different from all the other social sciences, because we employ those really scientific models to explain phenomena. But what it really is really a study of how people make choices within the framework of limited resources and unlimited needs and wants. So in essence, we are trying to understand, with the resources that people have at their disposal, as limited as those resources are, how do they actually answer some of their needs and wants? And some of the things that really become the very backdrop of it, if you go back to your high school and even early economic studies, is that there's needs and wants, and people need to differentiate between needs and wants. You know, your needs become those things you can't live without, and then your wants become the things that you can live without. So that difference between the two then requires you to look at what resources are important for you to achieve those two as you try and live life. So basically, in a sense, that's what we're trying to do in economics. You've got people that need to live, so they've got needs and wants, but the resources that are available for them to actually meet their needs and wants are limited. So what choices are they trying to do? How do they maximize those resources, and how do they then get value at the end of it, at the end of that process? So that's basically what we're trying to do in economics.
Now I have a basic understanding of it.
Yeah.
Looking back, do you feel economics prepared you for the work you do today?
I actually think it did. Because, like I said, one of the things about economics that's really interesting is that it's a dynamic subject, because you're studying people as they evolve, as they make choices, particularly within the realm of economics and finance, right? And we know that people are multifaceted. We are fathers, we are mothers, we are all these sort of things. We are work people, we are all, but within the confines of finance and economics, people constantly change. And some of these changes actually are exogenous to them. In other words, the changes and dynamism in the world of economics and finance is often endogenous, in the sense that it doesn't emanate from the person or the people themselves. And some of it is endogenous, so it's within themselves as they make those sort of decisions as well. So it's quite dynamic. Every single day we're trying to explain and look at people and observe and see how they apply themselves in the world, and different theories then come to play, and then we model some of those things. So I'm saying that's where mathematics and statistics and all these things come into play. But that's what we do. So in my world of work, and when I look at my career, I think the studying economics has given me skills, has sharpened my ability to be analytical. So that's number one, which is quite key. That saying by one of the philosophers who said that it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to grapple with a thought without accepting it. And that's a lot of what we do in economics. Come up with those thoughts and be analytical and look at both the pros and the cons. And I remember first year, my lecturer used to say that if you take 10 economists and you put them here, and you ask them one question, should we increase interest rates or not? You'll probably get 10 different answers, and that's simply because of the analytics that we need to think about and then apply that to theory and then come up with suggestions as well. So I see myself applying those analytical skills across my career. So that's number one. Number two, we are so obsessed as economists with projections and trying to understand phenomena before it happens. So we try and look at what inflation would look like. And if inflation is at this level, what does it mean for everyone in that country, the economy, globally, and all those sort of stuff and all that. So analytical skills, as well as the ability to think, be always one step ahead, and have foresight and projections and predictions is one of the things that I think I've actually learned. And I think I see myself applying that in my career. Because part of where I am in my career now is about the development of about 4,000 SMEs, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But it's my ability to then look at, because within economics, by the way, there's a subject called microeconomics. So macroeconomics looks at the bigger, broader economic concepts, inflation, unemployment, foreign exchange, and all that. But within microeconomics, we study industries, right? So sectors within the industry, and then we study the players within that industry. So I deal with SMMEs from varied and very different industries. So my ability to get myself into, for example, manufacturing, and just look at manufacturing and be able to look and have conversations with an SMME in that space to say, what does it look like in the next 5 years? What about the next 10 years? And how does that then affect you as an entrepreneur who's trying to build a business within this space and all those sort of stuff? So I do see how it has really helped and shaped a lot of how I do things and how I respond to certain things and my planning as well around the work that I do. So that's what I'm saying. I've never regretted studying economics ever since, because it has helped me to embed some of those skills.
You know, for the past few weeks, we've had headlines on the news about the rand manipulation against the
Yes.
dollar. Yeah, so are economists the reasons, how can I put it? So is it part of like your line of work, checking the rand manipulation, something? I don't know how to question it, but do you guys maybe like play a role
Yeah.
around it?
So that's a macroeconomic concept, right? And that's understanding how the currency of one country sort of interacts with other countries, because that's where the determination of the exchange rate is, the demand and supply of currencies. So how much of South Africa's rand is demanded in the global world, both by domestic and as well as foreign investors, right? And some of that then speaks to why do they actually need South African rand. So domestic investors obviously need, stronger rand, because what it then does is it allows them to import at a cheaper price if the rand is stronger. But for those that are trying to maybe buy in South Africa, that they don't want that, a cheaper South African rand is good for their investments you sit in. So the role of macroeconomic stability, so that is to ensure foreign exchange, inflation, interest rates, all of those things sit with the reserve banks of any country in the world. The Reserve Bank economists that are sitting at the Reserve Bank, and in our instance, the South African Reserve Bank, the Governor Lesitja Kganyago, who I hold in very high regard, by the way. These are people that are concerned with those type of things. So if there's any manipulation of the rand or any interference in the rand, then it's their duty to make sure that they do that. Now, let me qualify this very quickly, Tshepiso. So if you look at the market for foreign exchange, should ideally, if you look at, if you come to think about the invisible hand from Adam Smith, the market for foreign exchange should be driven by demand and supply. So how much of the rand is demanded by both domestic as well as foreign investors, and how much of the rand that we have can actually be supplied, and how much of the demand can we meet. And then from there, those forces of demand and supply in economics, they will move towards what we call equilibrium. Equilibrium is a point at which demand meets supply. And at that point, you're going to determine the price in the market for foreign exchange, as well as the quantity that is going to be supplied. So in simple terms, what that means is, should the rand be 10 rand to the dollar, or should it be 7 rand to the dollar? As you said right now, it's sitting at 16, 17 rands. Is that determined by the markets? Right? The market will move it. The so-called invisible hand will move it to that equilibrium. That's why myself, as a classical economist, I believe that there's no interference that's required in the market. Allow the demand and supply forces to determine that equilibrium, right? But now we're living in a world where I think, because of the systems that each country almost chooses, South Africa has not chosen a purely capitalist market. And they've got good reasons for that, because there's always market failures. And so if there's market failures, the government must intervene. There's always things that we call public goods. And those are goods that are supplied at scale that the private sector has no incentive to play a role there, because the returns on investment versus the costs that you need to incur to play in that market just doesn't make sense. And so the government then steps in to supply and sort of become the conduit in that market. So and then the South African, like I said, government has chosen to say where there's a market failure or where it's a public good, we will intervene, right, and sort of try and correct the market, as it were, as opposed to leaving it for the invisible hand to move it towards demand and supply. So what will the Reserve Bank do then? The Reserve Bank, in fact, as it is right now in terms of policy in the foreign exchange market, is that they don't get involved in the foreign exchange market at all. If they were getting involved, they would have either pegged what we call PEG, the rand against the US dollar or any other major currency, but they've chosen to let it float. So floating, in essence, what it is let the price be determined by the market. So it ensures liquidity of the South African reserve, the South African currency, which is the rand, but also it makes it very attractive to investors, both domestic as well as international markets. You'll find that Botswana is pegged its currency against the South African rand. Zim has done the same thing. Namibia has done the same thing as well. Same thing. So in other words, 1 rand for 1 maluti in Lesotho. 1 lilanga for 1 rand. Same thing as the Namibian dollar as well. So they've pegged that. And there's very good reasons, because the South African rand is the most liquid of all the emerging market currencies. And so it's very attractive to investors because of that liquidity. And by liquidity, I mean it's easy to exchange the South African rand wherever you go. That's why you can get into Namibia, exchange the South African rand, no one is going to ask questions. You can into Zimbabwe, do the same thing, Lesotho, Eswatini, go up the African market, DRC. No one is going to ask any questions because of that liquidity as well. So the South African Reserve Bank doesn't get involved because it's a floating exchange rate. So when you have news of a manipulation,
I had a problem.
Okay. So what I was saying is, when you hear of the news of a manipulation in the foreign exchange market, you're speaking about an interference in the market, because South Africa, as I mentioned, has chosen a floating exchange rate where regulators don't get involved on the price that's set in the market for the South African rand. So the question then that the guys at the SRB have to answer is, who manipulated the rand and how did they do it, and to what ends were they trying to do that? Because you hear that there's banks that were involved. There's some other boogeyman also in the background there that was involved in the manipulation, which of course I sit and I'd really like to hear from the officials at the CRB, because that's their job. But that's what interference actually means.
Okay, so you've explained how it affects the country, but I want to know, how does it affect me as a citizen?
So let's take an example where the interference in the market of the rand is to weaken the South African rand, because some people say, and I've heard as well, the governor arguing that actually it should be 7 rands to the dollar. So, which means the interference in the market has weakened the South African rand to where it's sitting right now, right? Like I said, who has that, who was doing it, how they did it, it's an investigation that they need to do. But what it does is, if the interference is to weaken the South African rand against the dollar, it then means that it is pricier for South Africans, that is businesses and the like, to actually try and import products and services from outside South Africa into South Africa, because the rand is weaker against the dollar. And that then means it has a ripple effect, because if at 7 rand against the dollar, I can import a phone for 7 rand. And now I have to import it for 14 rand, right? So which means that when it gets to South Africa, it's going to cost 14 rand instead of 7 rand. So what that does is then South Africans are paying more for that particular product than other people elsewhere, right? So it has that effect. And I'm using that example to just drive the point that says it has very bad ripple effects in the sense that it makes prices and goods and services in the country to be more expensive, especially if we are bringing them into the country. And then, of course, you can talk about the ripple effect of that. Inflation then goes up. As inflation goes up, then prices go up. As prices go up, the disposable income of the average South African then starts reducing because of inflation. And all of that cycle then becomes self-fulfilling from there. But in short, what it does is that it makes goods and services that we import more expensive if the rand is weaker. And the more expensive they are, like any other business, they will pass those increases to the consumers. And you and I, sitting down here, then have to pay more than what is fairly the price if we allowed demand and supply forces to actually determine the price. Because I sense that the governor is actually saying if there was no interference and the dollar South Africa was determined by forces of demand and supply, it would be 7 rand to the dollar.
Oof. Okay. I feel like we are getting deeper and deeper. I just want to bring us back a little bit. You've completed an MBA and you are now pursuing a Master's of Philosophy in Development Finance. What motivated each qualification?
So the MBA was motivated to build strategic capabilities and also to just try and get a sense of what leadership looks like for me. In particular, because at the time it was relevant because I was starting to get into your more managerial positions in the different areas where I've worked. And so I wanted to understand strategically aspects related to leadership, strategic financial management, aspects around strategic operations, and the very important one, strategic HR as well. So looking at how do you manage your human resources strategically as opposed to operationally. And I'm not an HR person, but that distinction for me when I studied my MBA was really quite key for me. But it was really just to build my strategic thinking capabilities and understand what leadership style I sort of resonate with. And where I did my MBA, there had a course there, which I think you can't find in all the other MBAs within South Africa, which is called spiritual intelligence. And what that does is it taught us that you've got IQ, which is important, right? But it has limitations. Then you've got EQ, which a lot of us need to build a muscle around. It's important, but it also has limitations. And then there's now the element of spiritual intelligence. And the argument from the lecturer was always that these three things actually then determine your leadership style, and you can see that. So being spiritual intelligent is not really about what type of deity you subscribe to, but it's about how do you have foresight of things and deal with people in a manner that's empathetic more than just doing it when you're doing EQ. With regards to the MPhil in development finance, I mean, I'm a classical economist at heart. And as a classical economist, I'm more fascinated with data, statistics, models, all those sort of things, which if you look at them from their purely theoretical background, there's an element of it where there's no heart, there's no person behind it. So if you ask me right now, where the interest rate supposed to be reduced just the other day, my classical mind with my models in my mind is like, I think that was not the correct decision. But now development finance, what it does is it then brings into this classical economist that is me, an element of development and pragmatism. But more than anything, it's about solutioning, right? So some of the stuff we look at within development finance is small business finance. How do we fund small businesses within the African continent? Because it's pitched at Africa, the course. So what are some of the challenges from a development financing point of view for small businesses? It looks at things like infrastructure. How do we structure infrastructure across Africa. I mean, you'd know that the infrastructure gap within Africa is sitting at over 100 billion US dollars every year, and commercial banks can only supply about 50% of that. So the other 50% is needed because there's development infrastructure that's required across Africa for us to enable development. That's why there's a mismatch between the growth in the African continent and development. So you find that growth is growing. So African countries are actually growing. In fact, I looked at the latest IMF report for projection for 2026, and they're saying Africa is projected to grow to 4.6 from 4.1 this year. But that 4.6 is not trickling down to the average African, and that's the disconnect between economic growth and economic development. This course in development finance helps me to look at things more pragmatically and move away from empirical tools and empirical analysis to say, how do we solution for these things? How do we bring in an element of development into this stuff that then can help us to solution a little bit better? And I think that's what is missing in classical economics, the ability to think about development and bring in an element of people, because development is about people at the end of the day. So we can model these things and say whatever, but if people are not at the center of what we are doing, then we are not solutioning correctly from an economics point of view. So development finance for me brings in that pragmatism and ability to solution rather than to just theorize and come up with models that make sense. But because of that disconnect between economic growth and economic development, I think it closes the gap for me.
You keep on mentioning this term, classical economist. What is and how is it different from a traditional economist?
So traditional economists are actually classical economists. So we just use the word, and what that means is just an economist that looks at things from that end, empirical. We use models, we use data, we use statistics to explain phenomena. But your more developmental economists, which is now the place that I'm playing at, is to say, we hear the data, we hear the model, it's saying we're supposed to be going this way, which is what I'm saying to you. For example, if you look at the fact that South Africa has moved from a target band of 3 to 6% to now 3% with a buffer at either side, either 2% or 4%. Classically, they are targeting 3%. So in other words, whatever models they use, whatever data they are looking at, whatever modeling, financial and otherwise that they're using, they're targeting 40%. And the instruments that they are going to use will be 3%. If they don't get to 3%, classical economy says, it doesn't matter what happens, whether people are going to complain that things are going up. What you are doing as a classical economist is saying, I'm going to increase interest rates because this thing is not at 3%, this thing is at 5%, and it's supposed to be at 3%. So classical economists use that. So they use a yardstick that is rather harsh, if I may use that word, but it's not harsh in the sense that it's not driven by some sort of science. There is a science to it, but it's just saying we are supposed to be at 3% in inflation rate. We're at 5%, so that means increase interest rates. But if you look at the mandate for the South African Reserve Bank, they are targeting inflation in support of economic growth. So in other words, that's why they're saying that we are classical in our approach, but we need to think about development. In other words, how will an increase in interest rates affect the ordinary person on the street? How do we create some sort of buffer? They take a very harsh stance on matters where they see that we can't do anything but to increase interest rates. That's why they will always say whether it was unanimous or it was not unanimous, who was on the other side and who was not. Because that's very important to understand whether are they on the same page as independent economists sitting there. Are they on the same page? Because again, that's very important. But classical is traditional, if you want to use that word.
Oh, okay. So you also have a range of different certifications from ESG to financial modeling and data analytics. What gaps were you trying to close with this course?
I think ESG for me was more around tapping into the world of sustainability. And I know people define sustainability differently, but I think ESG is a subset of that sustainability. And this is simply because we live in a changing world, a world where we need to start thinking about how the utilization of limited resources today has an impact on either making the future generation to still enjoy the same resources that we have, or how our depletion or the rate at which we are depleting resources right now may affect future generations. So, for example, we are enjoying as a country the resources that we have, but the rate at which we are depleting them needs to be consistent with our and great children that are going to come after this, because they too are dependent on that. There's a couple of mining towns in South Africa. If you look at them now, they are almost ghost towns simply because. So I was just saying that the ESG certificates and modeling were really around building the capability to look at sustainability issues, precisely because, as I was arguing, Jorge, we need to be able to think about the future generation so that they also enjoy the type of benefits that we are enjoying right now. And my assessment, if you look at most mining towns, is that we are depleting at a rate that the future generation will not be able to actually benefit from them. So we've got ghost towns in South Africa precisely because of that. So the elements of sustainability become important, and they need to be taken into account. But issues around climate change, issues around, the world moving to greener and more cleaner energy and all those sort of stuff are important. And that's why ESG becomes quite important. So that's why I went into that field. And I'm still in that field as well, learning a bit, because my PhD studies, and something we'll talk about maybe some other time, but my PhD studies are looking at ESG in the context of SME development.
So, which of these skills has become unexpectedly useful to you?
ESG has become very, very useful to me, because my work and where I work, I interact quite a lot with the mining industry. And as someone who comes in my early career, as someone who was in the mining industry as well. So at the time, there was no sustainability issues, at least not at the level at which they are becoming important right now globally, but also in South Africa. So when I look at all of these things, I'm able to sit and talk sustainability, both with the mining industry, the finance industry, many other, even agriculture becomes quite key for me as well. But I'm able to have those sustainability conversations with all these different stakeholders: culture, mining in the main, tourism, as well as I mentioned, within the financial sector as well. So I think all of these do connect in a way.
So, you've worked across multiple industries: mining, development, ESD, project management, and enterprise growth. How would you describe your career trajectory?
I think I would say, firstly, I'm blessed to have had the opportunity and the exposure to these different industries. I think it was something that I never really planned. In other words, the exposure to all these different industries. But I think the careers and the industries themselves almost found me, if I may use that word, because I think it was planned, but the opportunities that then came, and the trajectory of my career as well, was really, I think, a blessing first of all. But I think these industries found me, and I'm blessed to have this conversation, because I've never actually had that question in my mind and have to think about what it means. But I think the shortest one, I really have no other answer except to say, I think they found me, and I'm blessed to have worked in these industries.
So now, if a 5-year-old were to come to you and ask you, what do you do for a living, what would you say? How would you describe it?
What do I do? That's a very difficult one. I think for a living, I would say that I'm a development practitioner. I think that sums it up, right? I'm a conversationalist as well. My last radio was actually this year in March at UFM. I was doing a business show there, and I enjoy having those conversations around business, investments, the economy, and all those sort of stuff. So I think I'm a development practitioner who dabbles a little bit around conversations in this space as well. And I enjoy solutioning more than anything. So, but in essence, at the very core of it, I think I'm a development practitioner. That's what I do. I look at development issues.
And now I'm feeling the pressure. You were a radio. You had a radio show. You were doing a radio show.
Yes, so for the last 6 years or 7 years, if you want to look at it like that, I've had the opportunity to work in different radio stations. In the main, as I started off with an online radio station. I remember it was in Braamfontein back in the days. It still is even operating till today. I then moved into a more Pan-African French-speaking radio station. I think it has since closed down because the market in South Africa was not conducive for it. It was anyways targeted at Francophone countries in Africa, so you're French speaking, but it was based in South Africa, and because of the infrastructure and resources that they could tap into here. I then moved into a Christian radio station, and I was doing a business show there. I think the first if you look at Christian radio stations, we were the first to ever launch a business show there. That's where then my last work this year was at the commercial radio station UFM in Northwest.
So you can also speak French.
Except for bonjour, merci beaucoup, and all those sort of stuff, the basic stuff. I can try. I mean, it's been 3 years since I left there, so I was learning French, but now I can only say bonjour and merci beaucoup and just the basic stuff. Don't ask me to speak it because
So you currently manage development programs for over 4,000 SMMEs. What does a day in your role actually look like?
Interestingly, so when I came in at the entity last year, the position was not there, right? And it was a new position. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into at the time because it sounded like, you're going to be the head of programs, develop, programs for the development of. So I was like, this thing looks really nice and I can do that. The shock of my life, getting in there is that there was never a position like that. So that means then, you need to get into, suppose your MBA and think about strategically, what are the main strategic things that we need to do, putting together the team, making sure that the team is capacitated, developing a 3-year, a 5-year strategy, understanding what's the tapestry of the SMMEs that you're dealing with. So in other words, walk into each and every one of those SMMEs and understand where they are, what they do, what industries they're in, what's their gap, development gap, and try and look at what solutions you can come up with, look at the macro as well as the micro within the space, and some of the stuff that is needed by the SMME. So that's what I needed to do. And it's a strategy that we have developed over time. It's been 1.5 years now. And I think we're at a stage where we are moving quite a bit. It's not yet finalized, particularly because there's elements of that strategy that we need to work with. But on a day-to-day basis, really, when I get to the office, it's tracking where we are from a strategic point of view. We've broken that down into monthly, bi-weekly, weekly, and all those sort of stuff. And so we need to track all of those things. And then it's mainly meetings, literally from the moment I walk in to the time I actually leave the office. If it's not our partners and strategic implementation partners that we need to work with, it's about the SMMEs that we have and work with. It's also about funders and as well as looking at, your governmental institutions that are also important parts of the ecosystem of the development of SMMEs. And so playing that role is key for me on an everyday basis. But if you were to walk into my office, it's literally that meetings from 8 o'clock when I come in to about 5. I'm supposed to leave at 5, but often at times it's 6 o'clock on the average day.
What are the biggest pressures or diseases you have faced in that position?
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest decision that I've had to face was when we needed to sort of think about what does the structure look like for what we want to achieve. Remember I mentioned how we had to develop a strategy, develop what does the strategy look like? How are we going to deliver on the strategy? What are the key things for the next 3 to 5 years? And then look at then who are the people that we need for us to do that, both internally and externally as well. I think the external part is easy because you're looking at your partnerships, you're looking at strategic partners, funders, ecosystem players, and all that. But I think the most difficult question, a difficult thing that I've had to deal with was internally then deciding for it. How do we make sure that we've got a team that is fit for purpose? And I think that conversation is always a very difficult conversation because it's conversations around, do we have the right people in the right places? Are they doing the right things? Are we responding to what, market needs, the SMMEs in this particular instance? And are we solving the things that we should be solving? So one of the most difficult things was to look at internally and say, are we fit for purpose or are we not fit for purpose? And if I may answer what might be the next question from there, I would literally say we are still a work in progress. I think the decisions that we've made about putting together a structure that we know is the ideal structure, that is in place, and I'm happy about where we are in that instance. Now we are just making sure we fill it with the right people. So sitting and having conversations and looking at people's careers and trajectories and how they think they fit into what we are trying to do is a very difficult conversation.
So you sit at the intersection of strategy, budgets, stakeholders, and implementation. How do you maintain balance across so many
Thapiso, there's a lot, I must say. And I think I always find that it's a very precarious position to be at. I may have dealt with some of it in my earlier parts of my career, but I think it's a very precarious and very difficult position to be at because you are expected to think strategically and be able to have strategic conversations, but also be able to cascade those strategic conversations into operational every day and tracking what we're doing every day to make sure that we are still answering both questions. Because some of our more strategic partners and people don't want to talk operational stuff. Our operational people don't understand, at least to the fullest extent, our strategic thing. So how I navigate that is I need to understand who am I speaking to and what matters to that person. So if I'm speaking to the board, I know I have to be very high level and specific. I can't meander around and explain a whole lot of other things. I just need to be very high level and specific. When I speak to my team, then we need to dissect and have several conversations about that. So I navigate it by understanding who am I talking to and what's important to that person. Tapiso? It depends who am I speaking to. So I need to understand who am I speaking to so that I know at what level am I pitching the It's okay.
From your perspective, what is the true purpose of enterprise and supplier development beyond?
That's a very important question, Thapiso. And I think as people in this space, we always need to answer this very honestly. I think the earlier parts of enterprise and supplier development and the spirit behind enterprise development, I think it was good. The intents were good, and what we're trying to achieve was actually good. But I think my view, and I've shared this with some of my colleagues in the space, that I think we need to move from enterprise development because that's mechanical, and often, as you have also might picked up, is that it's about compliance. How do you get SMMEs to comply and all that? I think that's just a myopic view. But I think we need to move towards what I call enterprising development as opposed to enterprise and supplier development. And what that really means is that we need to think about whether our interventions as development people in this space are interventions that are sustainable and also are building sustainability within the enterprise and supplier development space, right? So the way we used to do things is no longer relevant precisely because we are living in a changing world. So we need to integrate an element of sustainability. But I think enterprising also means that we are readying the SMMEs and making them ready for a world that is changing as well. So for us as practitioners, it's how we deliver sustainable enterprise development from our side as opposed to mechanical and compliance-led, but thinking beyond that and solving for that for sustainability. But it's about also getting the SMMEs ready for a changing world. And I think lastly, it's a piece around how do we think global while we come up with localized solutions. And the reason for that is because at some stage, some of our SMMEs within our enterprise supply development must interact with global events such as the G20 that is taking place in South Africa. What's their role? How do they see themselves playing in that field? Because I can tell you now, with the billions of rands that are going to be spent to, work on G20, but the trillions of rand that will also be spent in terms of boosting the local economy through that event on its own. Our SMMEs need to understand where do I play a part here, and how do I reap the reward. So I think it's those three things, so it's how do we as practitioners think about sustainability in what we are doing so that we can be forward thinking for enterprising development? How do we get our SMMEs ready for a changing world? How do we think global and come up with solutions that are localized? And maybe that's a space between the enterprise and supply development practitioners as well as the SMMEs themselves.
So, as South African, are companies in say achieving this purpose, or is there still
I think there's a disconnect. I think corporate South Africa is driven by what matters, and I don't think there's anything wrong in that. But it has its own limitations. So, in other words, corporate South Africa is saying, how do I navigate a regulatory environment, as opposed to how do I take regulations and start building sustainably beyond that? So in other words, if industries is expected to spend 1 rand on SMMEs, it will spend 1 rand and not even 1 point short or whatever the case might be. They will spend 1 rand because 1 rand means I get 5 points from an ESD point of view. If it moves to 2 rand, then I will spend 2 rand to get my 5 points, because it is those points that I need for me to be able to continue to work. And I've said with miners, I've said with some of the corporates, the argument is always that we don't have resources as well. And some of them will tell you, oh, nah, I'm a miner. In essence, I am a miner. The CEO of a mining company will tell you, I'm a miner, and that's what I do. That's what I'm saying. There's nothing wrong with that, because that's their core expertise. We just need to find a way to say, how do we then marry your core expertise and what you do with development? And that's where the gray area comes. And that's why we then play in that space as well. But I think we need to start thinking more strategic so that it's not transactional. So at this stage, to answer you, Tsepiso, I think it's transactional. It's what matters to get me across the board, but it's not really sustainable.
You've worked with SMMEs on what are the 3 biggest facing small business?
I'm glad you answered that. You asked that question. It always comes up in these conversations. So what are the things that are inhibiting the growth of SMMEs? And I think that's one part, but the other part is how do we solve for that? But I think these 3 things for me are important. The first one, and I think is very important, is we find that there's a lack of aspiration within the SMMEs themselves, because we find that there are SMMEs who are truly entrepreneurial. They are innovative, they are solving a problem, they are agile, they are making sure that within the space where they operate, they are forward thinking and all those sort of stuff. Those are entrepreneurs. And then you do find survivalists in this space who are saying, I can't get a job with South Africa's high unemployment rate, so I can't get a job. So the next best thing is I'm next to a mine, or there's a corporate, I can supply them with whatever. And so I go to that particular corporate and say, what do you guys need? I can supply it. So I become a jack of all trades, and in the process mastering and nothing, because that's what it is. And so that's the difference we need to always be careful of, because you find the higher end of it is survivalists, and very, very few entrepreneurs within the South African landscape. The first problem that I think is the hurdle is with the SMMEs themselves, is that there is no want or need or even the aspirations that they have for them to be able to grow from there. And then the second one that I think is also inhibiting Tsepiso is the issue of resources and innovation. The truth is that in every developing economy, and even emerging markets, but I think emerging markets are much, much better. But in every developing nation, particularly within even Africa as well, and it's also true within South Africa, is that SMMEs operate within a resource-constrained environment. So they don't have the resources that they actually need for them to be able to, deliver, for them to be able to do the work that they need to do and all that. Now, I'm talking about entrepreneurs. I'm not talking about survivalists. I'm talking entrepreneurs who have gone past aspirations and they know what they're trying to do. Once they are clear about what they're trying to do, what solution they're solving, it's often that they lack resources and they need to start thinking about resources. And my argument with them with this second constraint is that resource constraint is one thing, but what about resourcefulness? So in other words, you need the entrepreneurs to move beyond that. I'm constrained. I can't operate because I lack this and lack that and lack that and lack that. Yes, you lack those things. You don't have those resources, but how do you build resourcefulness? And that speaks to an element of innovation. So I think that's another one that constrains SMMEs and their growth as well. And I think, and within that, by the way, there's lots of opportunities, because I think that's what I'm saying. Once you know your resource constraints, you must know how to be resourceful so that you move beyond those resources. Things like social capital, which I don't think a lot of us think about as a solution to some of the resource constraints that we face as entrepreneurs, when we're trying to build our businesses. You can take advantage of your social capital. You have a network. You've got people around you. You can use some of them to help you solve your constraints that you have. And that's always the challenge that I bring to entrepreneurs. And then the third one, and by the way, I'm mentioning them in this order because that's how I see them. The first one, the biggest, is aspirations. We've got people who are not entrepreneurs, who are trying and doing things that, it's not really their space, but they're trying to solve an unemployment problem. Maybe we should get jobs for those people. But your entrepreneurs, once they've moved aspirations, they move into resourcefulness. That's where they need resources. But the third one, which is the least important, but very, very important, and that's why I did my MBA dissertation based on, it was around access to finance. And not just access to finance, but access to developmental finance. And that's simply because if you look at credit markets in South Africa, Africa, and even the rest of the world, by the way, if you look at credit markets, they are not built in such a way that they support SMMEs. Credit markets look at SMMEs as risky. They don't have financial statements, so I don't even know what this business is about. They lack formality. Most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, you find that most SMMEs operate within the informal sectors. An investor with money looks at them and says, "Hey, that's risk for me because this person is not even registered," and all that. Without, of course, looking at what causes those sort of things. It's those things that, credit markets look at and say, this is risk. And so you have a credit market failure. Also things like those people are not educated, lack of education and mechanisms around that are also lurking. And so that becomes an inhibitor. And as someone who's as you mentioned, sits in a board where we do investment in particularly your early stage SMMEs. These are things that we need to deal with, credit market failures, and how we solve for those credit market failures in order to enable and open up the resources. It's lack of aspirations from the SMME themselves. They're not most are not aspirational entrepreneurs. You also have resources and innovation as number two. And I think the third one is access to developmental finance. I think those are things and challenges that SMEs face.
Do you feel like, do you think that the government is helping the SMMEs in any way, or they're just spending for?
I mean, if you look at some of the interventions that government has been coming up with, I would like to think that they are moving towards that direction of helping SMMEs, right? There's work that must be done by government. There's work that must be done by the SMMEs. There's work that must be done by the private sector. There's work that must be done by development practitioners in this space. And so it's an ecosystem, and that's what I keep referring to. It's an ecosystem to build entrepreneurship in any economy. So I would say that government is doing something. Whether that's effective or not, I think we need to do studies on the return on that. But there is something that's been done. I think development people are also doing something. SMMEs are doing something. We need to just get the commercial banks, private investors, those institutional investors need to come on board. Can I share just one thing while we are here at Thapiso? Do you know that there's over 852 commercial banks in sub-Saharan Africa, and these 852 commercial banks in South Africa, in Africa, only invest 3% in small businesses. Now that's a challenge. You've got 852 across sub-Saharan Africa, but none of them are investing money in SMMEs. So that's what I'm saying. There's something that government is doing with the limited resources that they have. There's something that development practitioners are doing with limited resources. SMMEs are there. They are coming to the party. They are doing what they need to do. But there's this credit market failure, which I think because these commercial banks and traditional banks and investors look at SMMEs as very risky. And so we need to de-risk that. That's what I'm saying. It's not access to finance that we need. It's access to development finance. So I think government is doing something.
For SMMEs to get funding, what do they?
I think it's a multifaceted answer to that, right? So there's an element of trying to make sure that you get your compliance ready. It doesn't make sense that you operate in an informal way when you are going to seek for formal financing. Again, because we need to appreciate that capital is not cheap, from the investment side or even the SMMEs themselves when they need to repay back the capital deployed. So capital is not cheap. And neither are we advocating for cheap capital when we talk about development finance. It's not cheap capital, but it's capital that is needed. So SMMEs need to sort out their compliance. And I think government has created, particularly in South Africa, and I know the challenge is huge in Africa, but within the South African market, government has enabled an environment where the red tape that most of the SMMEs were complaining about in the earlier years to a large extent has been taken away. So the cost of formality has been reduced in South Africa. So that's the one bit that has been done. The other issue of compliance speak to understand the industry that you are in and what is compliance looks like in that particular sector. So once you can solve for that, then it moves you to the next level where it can be important. So for example, if you're in construction, you must understand that there's the need to sort out your CIDB because there's no fund that was going to give you money, but there's no market that's going to be given to you as an opportunity that will be given to you if you're not compliant from a CIDB level, because then we're taking chances with you. We don't know whether you're going to do this according to the standards that are required. So understand the compliance that's required in that space. So formalize your businesses. And by the way, I forgot just the other thing. Formalizing speaks to registering the business. It speaks to getting your annual financial statements in place. It speaks to putting together processes and procedures in business, HR, finance, all those sort of things. Sort out that and then sort out, of course, the compliance bit to it. And I think that once you've solved these two, markets as well as capital becomes easy then to access from that end. So I think that's where the gap is. And if you can solve for that, it would be much easier.
Okay. So the role of ESG and impact investing is growing in South. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for transformation?
Sure. So answer it very, very straight to the point. I think I see four opportunities or four sectors where there's opportunity. Do you know that Thapelo, and I'm shocked to look at these statistics as well, but over 40% of Africa has no access to power. So we have a power problem in Africa, right? So that's over 40%. This is a continent with 1.3 billion people, and 40% to 50% of those people, almost half, actually don't have access to power. When we are complaining in South Africa about load shedding and all that, there are countries where load shedding is a permanent feature of their life. And if that's an issue, then we need to start thinking about, from an ESG and impact investing point of view, that's where opportunities lie within the renewable energy space. Because the fossil fuels that we are using obviously have an impact on the environment and all those sort of stuff. But I see an opportunity there that I think, development finance people as well as capital can come in there to solve that problem of that renewable energy space there as well. And then the second one where I see opportunities, particularly for ESG and impact investing, is around infrastructure. Currently, Africa sits at an infrastructure gap of $100 billion every single year. And if you look at South Africa, that's a gap around 6.2 trillion rand that we need to spend on infrastructure. So that's why you hear our government speaking about infrastructure spend and all those sort of stuff. Why? Because there's a there's an opportunity within that space. And why is infrastructure important? It's important because you need roads. You need a connected road and transport infrastructure that will allow for the movement of three things. One, you want to allow for the movement of goods and services within and outside of connected transport systems, for example. So you need to move goods and services. You need to move people. So people must be able to go to work and do what they need to do so that they can, facilitate economic activity in the country. And most importantly as well, I think you need to move capital, right? So you need the right banking and finance infrastructure. And of course, South Africa has the most advanced in Africa, but second to none, of course, even across the world. If we're not in the top 5, the last time I checked, we're in the top 2 or 3 when it comes to our banking sector and the sophistication of the financial system in South Africa. So you need these 3 things. You need infrastructure that will move capital, that is capital markets in and outside of a country. You need to move goods and services. You need to move people. So all that infrastructure is important. And if Africa needs $100 billion each year, which we don't have, then we have a problem. So we can't grow the economy. And the last time I checked, I think commercial banks were speaking that they can raise half of that 100 billion, but they don't have the other 500 billion that's needed for that. So infrastructure, I think, is another opportunity there. I think climate adaptation and mitigation is another opportunity, precisely because Africa is the most affected by climate change. And we didn't originate, at least as a continent, some of the climatic issues that we are facing of a cold weather or a very, very warm and hot weather. And somewhere in between the two, I think someone was saying that we were supposed to be in South Africa, in the world by now, sitting at 10th. We are slightly just below because of adaptation and mitigation of climate change, which is a good thing, right? So the economics behind that is always interesting, but that's a good thing because then it means we are moving as the world towards a better climate environment, right? But let me tell you, the gap, at least in Africa, where we are sitting, is somewhere around 499 billion US dollars that we need for adaptation as well as climate mitigation. So there's an opportunity there for ESG people and impact investing as well, because you're investing in something that's going to change the environment, the people, and all those sorts of stuff. Because remember, with climate change, there's diseases, there's sicknesses, there's illnesses because of climate change and all those sort of stuff. So if you can invest somewhere in there, it's really impactful because it's affecting people's lives. I think the last one really is looking at when we are doing impact investing, we can't leave SMMEs behind because they are the lifeblood of any economy. China is driven by SMMEs. UK is driven by SMMEs. Africa, particularly South Africa, over 90% of the South African economy is driven by SMMEs. I always use the example of a pyramid. If you look at a pyramid, there at the top is just few corporates there, corporate South Africa that's turning billions and billions of rands. Then you've got the middle part there. This is now your growth SMMEs. And then you've got at the bottom part of it, you've got your informal sector. And that informal sector is creating jobs, it's creating opportunities and all that. It's just that it's informal and all those sort of stuff. There's challenges and opportunities there. But in essence, I think these 4 things, Sepiso, is where I think opportunities for impact investing lie. Renewable energy, infrastructure, climate, adaptation and mitigation, as well as, of course, then the development of SMMEs.
So, what misconceptions do people have about ESD and development?
Sure, that's a difficult one. But I think some of the misconceptions are that ESD is about compliance or ticking the box. And that's why my argument is, I think the intent of the law and regulations were great, but we must move beyond that. That argument, I think, has come to an end. ESD, or enterprise and supplier development, is not about compliance. There's an element of it is about building compliance in the SMMEs, but we need to incorporate sustainability, ESG, pact investing, sustainable investing. Those type of things become very important. So I think that's the first misconception, that we are going to, as a corporate, because we must spend 3%, we're going to take this 3% and give it to Thapelo, and Thapelo go and use this to develop the compliance of SMMEs and give us our points back. I don't think that's what ESD is about. That's why I'm saying we must move from enterprise development to enterprising development. I also think that the other misconception is that SMMEs need money. SMMEs don't need money. I don't think SMMEs need money. That's why in my challenges, I mentioned that the access to finance is important, but it's not the panacea. It's not going to solve some of the challenges around enterprise and supplier development. You can give an SMME 100 million. If they don't have the right compliance, if they don't have the right structure, they don't have systems and processes and all those sort of stuff, what's going to happen is the equivalent of I blow it. So they will blow their companies because they don't have the right structure. So it's like the same thing. If you've never had 10 million in your account, most probably going to blow that money very quickly because you've never dealt with 10 million in an account. But if you've dealt with 10 rand, then you made it 20, then you made it 100, then 1,000, then 10,000. By the time you get to 10 million, it's easy to manage that because you've built the capacity, you've built the muscle, you've put up processes of budgeting, putting structures in place, monitoring where you are spending your money, looking for opportunities where there's overspending and all that. You build that muscle so that 10 million rands does not blow up. So I don't think SMMEs need money. They just need to be capacitated and build correctly for them to do that. I don't think, again, ESD is about incubation. I think we must move beyond incubation. There's a place for it, but I don't think that's the be and end of ESD. I think we need to move beyond that and start thinking a little bit ahead. And then last one is what I did touch on. I don't think development finance that's supposed to go to ESD is really about just giving cheap money. I think it's giving money where money is needed so that you can develop enterprises as well as opposed to doing enterprise development. I think those four things come to mind on those misconceptions.
So you don't think that SMMEs need financing? It shouldn't more of a priority. They need resources. So do you there are places where they get those resources, those information, are they being about what they
I think information is there. We live in a world where at the click of a button there's information. I think we live in a world where there's all sorts of social media platforms that's disseminating information. Some of it, of course, is what the other guy from across the world always calls fake news. One needs to be able to look at some of the information that is fake. But I do think that information is there. It's out there. The resources are there. They need you to go towards the resources and find those resources so that you can then be able to sort of tap into them and see what can be done and what you can achieve. So I think information is there. So we live in an information age. There's no lack of information. You can type any type of word you can think of. There's something about it written somewhere. Even if you type your name, you realize there's lots about you there that's already out there that may or may not have been written. But information is there, resources are there. But like I said, most of our entrepreneurs have no aspiration at all to build enterprises. Most of them is really survival and just getting the next meal. And if I can use an opportunity to just supply water, then it's fine. I don't need to think about how do I actually, what's the content of this water? What's the alkaline in this water, if any? How do I take water and make it a sustainable business? Most of entrepreneurs don't do that. They just think, okay, there's no opportunity to supply, let me supply water. Next thing, there's a tender that comes out, supply us with computer mouses. They do the same thing. They take that and send. So information, I think, is there. Resources are there. It's just we must build aspirations within SMME so that they know what they are working towards, what are the most important things, so that, again, we move better from there and build enterprises as opposed to trying to do enterprise development.
So SMMEs Pila, they consist of a person with a spaza shop. We can consider them as an SME.
Yes. Yeah. So the Department of Small Business has actually issued out a very interesting categorization just about 2 months ago. I remember I saw it on one of their social media platforms. So they use revenue to measure whether someone is an SMME or not. So they borrow part of that from the Triple BE Act. So the Triple BE Act gives you an EME, an exempted micro enterprise, but it's also based on revenue as well. But in the main, they use revenue to determine whether someone is an SMME, and I think they play around 0 to 50 million a year is considered an SME. Of course, in different stages of the SMME trajectory or the SMME journey. But again, that's very mechanical. We need to think about developmental categorization. At what stage is the SMME at in their business life stage for us to even look at whether someone is an SMME or not? But I think using revenue as the only descriptor is missing out on some of the nuances within the space.
Okay. So, you've grown into and executive levels. One of the leader I
Yo, I think I've had, like I said, a couple of years ago when I was thrust into a management position, it forced me to start thinking about, what that means for me and what I need to capacitate myself in. But let me preface my answer by saying, I think there's a difference between a manager as well as a leader, right? I feel that a manager is more concerned with activities and a leader is more concerned with driving vision, right? And I'll make an example. Why do I say that? If you look at a typical example of an aeroplane or an airplane, some call it, there is a particularly good reason why the pilot does not sit with the passengers. And in my view, the reason why a pilot does not sit with passengers, because the role of a pilot is to steer that aircraft or airplane to its destination. So we are all as passengers relying on the pilot to get us to OR Tambo, to get us to Cape Town, to get us to Durban, Mauritius, wherever the case might be. If he sat with us, then there's challenges in the sense of who's going to be driving this thing because it's sitting with us? Are we going the right direction? What if this thing is going to crash? Who's going to be able to scan the horizon and all that? So I always say to entrepreneurs and SMMEs in particular, that's what it's about. You need to be a lead. You need to be at the forefront of everything. Scan the horizon, look at potential upcoming challenges, look at upcoming issues and find solutions to solve them before you get to that, right? So then using that analogy, I would say a manager is more responsible or spends most of their time on managing activities, whereas I think a leader is more about the vision. So I always say that that's the difference between the two. And a leader or a manager looks after deliverables and a leader inspires people to deliver. So that's what I subscribe to. I subscribe to leading by inspiring my team to actually deliver on the work. So that's my first preface. And so based on that, what I do is I don't get involved quite a lot in operational issues. I rather drive the vision. I offer support to my team. They know my office is always open. And when one of the things that I learned in leadership was when your team looks up, you must make sure that you're always available when they need you. And I think that's what I am. A more collaborative leader. I let people do what they need to do. I believe that people can think and use their brains and solve problems. I don't want to solve problems. I want to collaborate with a person and say, if you are bringing it to me, then you've seen it as a problem. So let's solve this problem together. So I think collaborative would be more a better explanation of the leader I
so
think
would
I
you
am.
say people are born to be leaders? They're not, or is this something?
Hey, I've struggled with that concept. I think I wrote a little bit of a piece on that on my social media a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years or so. And the question was whether, leaders are made or leaders are actually born, right? And I think that leaders can be made, right? Yeah, I think leaders can be made. There's no one who is beyond, there's no one who's beyond the leadership designation. So if you give people the right resources around them and you capacitate them, they can actually be leaders. Someone can be, born into whatever family, and it does not necessarily mean that they are leader. The fact that you're born into a president's house doesn't mean you're the next president. In fact, you could be the opposite to that. So I think I subscribe to that. With the right resourcing and support, you can make a leader. There's no one beyond leadership.
I love the answer that you gave. Uh, which
Mm.
leadership have taken you? Yes.
The leadership habit that I think is listening. Listening has taken me time. And I'm actually at a stage in my just career and personally where I am learning more than anything. Because I think as leaders, we often fall into the trap of thinking that you know everything. And it is that thought of thinking you know everything that makes you detached from your team, but also importantly, detached from learning. So I'm learning. That's where I am, to listen, because it is in the listening that I get to learn. There are things that come from my team, and I think this is really brilliant. If I did not listen, then we wouldn't be able to do some of those things. We recently, did an event just the other day, which is called a business level. And that's entirely an idea that came from, we need to build a networking session. It then became something big because in the process of preparing for it, we were listening to each other. And as a leader, I was there to listen. Where there's bottlenecks, where the team does not reach a consensus, then it can come to me, and then I need to listen to both, or everyone what their views are. And most of the time I've seen that work, because the clashes most of the time within a team is always egotistic or driven by ego to say, yeah, I want this thing done because I think this is right. No, but that's not right. That's not what we spoke about. And if you listen somewhere in between, then there's a solution. And when you listen to everyone and you spot the solution, you often find that it makes life easier. So I've had to build that listening skill. I remember in 2020, one of my team members couldn't deliver on a project that I had given to them. The day before, we had to submit reports, 80-page report to a client. The data that was needed for that, which was collected over a month, was nowhere to be found. And one of the things they told me was that we couldn't come to you. We feared you. We didn't think you'd listen to us. And that's when I think I changed from there to say leadership is about listening. And I've had to build that muscle. And I'm still building that even today.
An MPhil candidate in development finance, what impact do you hope your research or academic work?
It's changing what capital means and how capital is deployed to SMMEs. I think there's a gap. There's a massive, massive gap there. So if you look at my PhD work, is around using ESG as a tool to unlock capital finance for SMMEs. So I want to get to a point where development finance and impact investing actually does what it needs to do. Is relevant, is innovative, is impactful to the SMMEs, really drives change, and gets us to where we need to, because we need to build the entrepreneurial muscle within South Africa. It's a key thing to do. So my work really, my hope is that unlocking billions of rands for the development and deployment of very much needed capital in SMMEs. That's what I think impact would look like for me.
We've been throwing this word impact invest. For someone who doesn't know what it is, what would you say?
I think there's different ways in which people explain it, right? But in my world, I see impact investing as investing where there's materiality, and so that is contextual. It means you don't just invest for the sake of investing, but your investing is contextual. In other words, it understands the environment that you are dealing with, what are the problems that are there, and how capital then solves those problems, because that's what then will drive impact. But if we are going to just look at investing as just putting in money, then we are looking at investing from a quantitative point of view, and we are missing the qualitative nuances to investing. And I always argue that with my partners, or the ecosystem partners who are funders, to say impact is not only measured by return on investment, return on assets, how much the headline earnings per share, and all those sort of stuff, what's the ratios and all that. We must move beyond that and say, how is capital deployed in this space changing lives, and what is changing lives in this context? So that's why I say I think impact investing is using capital and the power of capital to invest in materiality in a certain context.
So, for young graduates wanting to work in ESD development or impacts, where should
I think start at school. Maybe before even studying at school, because that sounds very cliche. I think it's starting at understanding yourself and what really drives you as a person. There's a concept, it's a piece in economics, we call it underemployment. And underemployment speaks to people who are employed, but they're employed in areas that they did not study for. So that's underemployment. So if you factor that, you find that South Africa's broad unemployment is actually higher than the 40% that we talk about. But that's a discussion for another day. Maybe it's semantics for now. But I think understand what drives you, what makes you happy. So that's really important. And then get to school, because I think you will need both knowledge, skills that you get at school, the discipline that school does push you towards. It will help you to think about aspects related to problem solving and all those. So that muscle is actually needed, because in this space, I think that's where the gap is. The gap is around solutioning. In ESD, there's a massive gap. We are doing cookie cutter solutions most of the time. And that's a frustration of mine that I've, as I mentioned earlier on, kind of brought to colleagues in the space. So we need solutions. But I would say if you want to get into this space, love entrepreneurship. And that's key in this space. So if you don't love working with entrepreneurs, if you don't love entrepreneurship in itself, then the ESD space, I think, will be the most frustrating one, because it needs people that really love what they do, be able to always be one step ahead of entrepreneurs, understand industries they're in, what are the role players, what are the constraints and binding constraints and solutions that are near. So always needing to think about that is key, and you can only do that if you love. So do something that you're passionate about. That's number one. Go and get the education. It will help you, not just with, your education, but also your problem solving skills, those soft skills that are needed, but also love entrepreneurship. And for me, that's my biggest thing.
Can a person use any degree to get into those fields, or does it need a, a what degree for it? A different.
I think anyone, like any other industry, anyone can get into any industry, right? Because opportunities, you never know where opportunities lie. I mean, I've sat in this space, especially in my class, people who've morphed and moved away from being chemical engineers to being development people and dealing with development partners. I remember my first boss was actually an industrial engineer, but he fell in love with solving problems for SMMEs, and he found himself in the space. And then he went to school, did his MBA, and did his other entrepreneurship courses, and then so that he can augment his love for industrial engineering with solving problems. So every time we're faced with an industrial engineer who's running a business, it was exciting to see him just how easy it is for him to solve those problems for that SMME, because one, he understands the industrial side of things from an engineering point of view, but again, with education and getting into the space, you can do that. So, but if you can study your entrepreneurship, your business management, your finance, your economics, development studies, although development studies in their purest form do not deal with some of ESD issues, it's just, your social, your issues around demographics and some of the demographic challenges and all that. I think that's good. I mean, that's something to also pursue, and it might help us development practitioners, particularly looking at ESD, with some of that knowledge is important. I think if you can get into any of those careers I've mentioned, and study those things, it does help to give you the foundation that I think you would need to get in this space. As I mentioned, time, space, opportunities that present themselves to you. If you love this space, I think anyone can get into it, like most
You
careers.
mentioned you have a class. Are you?
No, I'm not. I'm not a lecturer. I'm hoping to get
Alright.
into lecturing very
Okay.
soon.
Then
Yeah.
many professionals struggle with career. What helped you stay grounded and intentional through?
I think having a proper plan helps you to stay grounded on the journey. Just to give you an example, just after COVID, I sat down and I asked myself, so COVID has shaken the world and has shown us things that we didn't know, or sometimes things that were already there we just took for granted. But it has really pushed us to think a little bit more. So I sat down, and so I have actually a 15-year plan for my life, which started in 2021. So that's about 21, 22, 23, 24, 4 years into my 15-year plan. The MBA, MPhil, the doctorate are things that are in that 10-year plan. And part of that 10-year plan includes things like setting up a fund at a certain time in my career. So I'm not just going to school for the sake of going to school. I'm not just studying certain degrees for the sake of studying them, ESG certification, not just for the fun of it. But there's a plan towards working towards a certain year that I need to achieve certain things. So I think that helps me. My mentor used to call this a true north. You must have your true north. Define what your true north looks like. And once you have that, then you will know what works and what doesn't work. And so even in your career, you will know what opportunity actually makes sense for what you want to do and which doesn't make sense. And I think that's why we meander quite a lot. So I once listened to a lecture from the CEO of Umalusi, who once said that the problem we have is that we are meandering like waters down a stream. When they hit a rock that's facing south, they go south. And if they go south and hit a rock that's facing west, the waters go west until they reach whatever stream into the sea and whatever the case may be. And saying the problem with that is that as you meander between a stone in the west and the south and all that, you're wasting time in between. But if you have a plan and you know what you want to achieve, and that true north, which is time bound, which is that smart goals, it's measurable, it's realistic, it's time bound, all those sort of things become important. So I think as a professional, have that, because it will then help you to know how do you navigate your career and stay true to what you want to achieve as well. There is a problem that I know I'm solving with all these career moves and academic moves, and I know where I'm going with all of those.
You also mentioned that what I would like to know, do you plan on taking on a mentee?
Yes, definitely. I think I've seen what the mentor did with me in my career, because that was a career mentor, someone that I looked up to in the space, and someone who had done quite a bit of work within the space as a legislator, but then also as a professional in this space. So she was implementing what she legislated, or played a role in legislating as well. So that was key for me to sit with her and learn from her. What was the spirit of ESD? What was the spirit around entrepreneurship? What were we trying to achieve with some of these regulations that you are coming up with in the enterprise and supplier development space? As you look at it currently, when I sat with her a couple of years ago, do you think we are doing the right thing? The answer was, that's why I left government and went into the private sector to do this work, because private sector was not getting it. They were just doing it as a tick box exercise. And so I saw that this is not sustainable. And so I made sure that I get into the space. But I think, yes, definitely mentorship has been crucial in my life. And that's just one mentor, by the way. I've got other mentors that I've strategically put in certain directions. As I said, my 15-year plan is divided into certain things, and each one of those has got someone that I work with, or kind of bounce ideas with, so that I can know I'm still in the right direction. So definitely I'll be more than happy to sit with people and help. I do have a few particularly that are high school learners that I do share a lot. I do speak publicly as well. Also quite involved in the space. I can do more, and I do think there's more to be done.
You said you do public speaking. What does your public speaking?
In the main, it's on personal finance. So that's a lot of what I do in the public space, as well as entrepreneurship. Yesterday, I was in a conference in Rustenburg on the Global Entrepreneurship Week, and my talk really was around developmental journeys of SMMEs. So those two are in the main the things that I talk about.
Earlier on, you said that you did radio for like 6 years. Would you go back into broadcast?
No, I would 100%. I would. I think It's great to keep up with what's happening in the world. It's great to get the news as they happen. Radio kind of gives you a space, an environment that I think other thing other spaces don't do that. I once spoke to Pat Komafani, who you might know as well, a broadcaster, who once said to me that radio is a theater of the mind. I've had the privilege of interviewing Professor Bonang Mohale, Mr. Khatebe from the Wits Business School, and a couple of other CEOs while I was at UFM as well. So really that will be something, because you get insights from people in the forefront of things, people in the industry, the decision makers and all those sort of stuff. So it's always great to take all of that and see how it makes sense to you. So definitely I would go back to broadcasting.
Well, with that being said, it brings us to the end of our conversation. So I want to take this moment to say thank you to Mr. Thapelo. Thank you for sharing your journey and your insights. I don't know if maybe you have parting words to share with the people.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Tshepiso, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, it's not something that I've done quite a lot, talking about my journey. And I think this forced me to really think. I love the questions that you shared with us. But I think my parting shots would be that Africa has a lot of opportunities. Africa is waiting for Africans to actually come up with solutions for its problems. I don't think that solutions will come from outside, but they will definitely come from us as Africans. So there's a lot of opportunity within the African space. And there's lots of work that we need to do. But I think with the right type of mindset, the right type of thinking, we can be able to achieve a lot of that. To young people, I would say, again, you've got a world that is your oyster. Take advantage of all the opportunities that present themselves to you. I often say that I don't think life is about doing one thing. You are not called to just be a doctor or just be an accountant or a civil engineer, but I think life is about, being this as well as being that. You can be a doctor who's an accountant so that you can do your own books as a doctor without necessarily always relying on someone else. So always find ways in which you can grow and develop yourself. Development is a journey as well. So young people shouldn't look at it from a static point of view, but every other time, ask yourself, what are you doing? How are you developing yourself? But more than anything, thank you so much, Tshepiso. I really appreciate the opportunity.